Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my first look at the Sony A6100. This mirrorless interchangeable lens APS-C camera is the least expensive model that Sony offers with an EVF in the A6 family, and in my opinion, it does check most of the boxes that I think the majority of users are in the market for. Now, a lot of the reviews out there essentially point to that you should just spend a little bit more money than the $600 price point that the A6100 brings to the table in order to get the features that it lacks. I understand that, and I agree with that to a certain extent. The extent ends with budget. I think the entire premise of the 6100 was to provide customers with an option for essentially the most affordable camera with an EVF in the A6 lineup, and that's exactly what it provides. So while I could agree that you would be better suited with, the A6400 or the 6500 or the 6600, whichever camera you want to use for this arbitrary argument, the reality is that the 6100 is aimed squarely at hitting the budget that people need. And with that said, why is every reviewer out there, YouTuber, written reviews, pointing at spending more money? The whole premise of this camera is to actually fit the budget. So working under the idea that this will fit your budget, I think that the majority of users that pick it up are going to be happy, at least with what it represents on paper. I haven't used it yet. Remember, this is my first look, this is my review unit, and it finally arrived. So until I actually use it, I'm not going to say that it's a home run, but on paper and knowing what Sony delivers, I have, I think, very realistic expectations. After all, I've covered pretty much every mirrorless camera that they've introduced over the years. If you follow my channel, you already know that. But let's talk about what it doesn't have, okay? And then we'll go through everything that it does. I have the A6300 right here next to it. I no longer have the A6000. A lot of people like to compare this camera to the A6000. They say it's the successor to the A6000. I wholeheartedly disagree. And that's because if there's any camera in Sony's lineup right now that I would call the successor to the A6000, it isn't the budget-friendly A6100. It's more like the flagship A6600, even though I understand why many people feel it's not flagship, the 66. There's no way the 6100 is a successor, in my opinion, to the 6000. The 6000 was a game changer. It was affordable. And the reason it was an affordable game changer is because Sony was in a very different world than it is now. It was not in command of the digital imaging mirrorless space. Now it pretty much is. And as a result, the 6100 is merely, the least expensive package that you can buy in the A6000 family. The first thing you'll notice between the 6300 and 6100, I think, is the fit and finish. With the 6300, you have a magnesium alloy build. With the 6100, we have polycarbonate. Now, that's one of the areas where it does resemble the A6000. It also has the same EVF that the A6000 has, but that's where everything ends. Yes, it has a 24 megapixel sensor, as does the 6300, but it's not the same exact sensor, and it certainly isn't the same processor. We now have 4K video with the 6100. I don't anticipate overheating because there is no limitation on 4K video recording. But what it's missing from, say, something like the A6400 or even the A6300, color profiles. We have them here in the 6300, we have them in the 6400, 6500, 6600. No color profiles for video in the 6100. And while a lot of people will say that's terrible, I don't think it's a big deal. Sony knows that if you need them, you'll buy the camera that supports them. If you don't need them, I think it's wise that they've given people an option. I think it's better to have options than none at all. They can't hurt you, right? So the 6100 does not have color profiles. It does, however, have the flip-up LCD that so many of the new A6000 cameras have. For example, the 6400 and the 6600, which are more expensive than this model. It also has the same autofocus system, 11 frames per second. We have real-time tracking in video, eye detection, which is a great feature. So arguably the best autofocus system in the mirrorless business, possibly in all of the DI world right now, especially if you're interested in video. Now, if you're not interested in video, it's less of an appealing feature, no question. But the A6300 over here does not have that capability. It has the same speed, but it doesn't have the real-time tracking, does not have the flip-around display. So those are, it's food for thought, something to think about. The buffer on the 6100 is slightly smaller than what you'll find on the 6400. But again, I think for those of you that are on that budget, it's a negligible difference that isn't a make or break feature, but still something you need to be aware of. Also, and this is another one of those faux pas, everyone who keeps saying this is the successor to the A6000, the first thing they lead with is, now it has a microphone jack. Again, I do not view this as a successor to the A6000. The 6000 launched in 2014. I think that we've had many so-called successors to the A6000. But the good news with this camera is that for $600 US, you have touchscreen functionality, another thing that people will point to the A6000 didn't have. Let's just focus on what this represents in the lineup. The touchscreen isn't for all of the menu features. It's specifically for a select few things that other Sony cameras have been able to do, and now they've added it. I already mentioned that the EVF is not high or not as high res as the other current models out there, but you can see the body, and ignore this L bracket that I have attached, this half cage, you can see the body is pretty much the same as the 6300, and that applies to many cameras in the 6000 family. One thing I can say that I do like about the 6100, other than the fact that we do have 4K video, that, as I already mentioned, is uncapped, the fact that we do have a best-in-class autofocus system here, is that we do still have a flash. Now, that's something that the A6600, which I really like, already reviewed a while back, does not have. They omitted that on the 6600. We are still working with a W series battery, even though it's not in there right now. So the same battery type that you have on every A6 camera except for the 6600, which of course now uses the higher capacity Z series battery. This is a generic that I have from Vemico. Really like the NPFZs because, well, they're game changers when it comes to having to swap out batteries compared to, the old W series, which is what this is still going to work off of. But you have to appreciate the fact that what Sony has done here is give you basically everything that you could get in the 6400 minus the things I've mentioned: lower res EVF, smaller buffer for both RAW and JPEG, continuous shooting. You don't have weather sealing, and no color profiles, but those are things that I'm not sure everybody needs. Now, I know many of you might think, well, everybody who's not shooting with a phone or a point-and-shoot camera needs those, but that's not necessarily true. Not everybody does color grading, and certainly not everyone is going to care about the extra headroom on the buffer or the EVF resolution or the weather sealing. Not everyone is trying to shoot in inclement conditions. So I think the 6100 has a pretty solid space, in my opinion, and the only reason I'm addressing it this late in its launch, which is very late for me, is because, again, I was waiting on a loaner from Sony, just as I was waiting on this guy, which, is the must-have lens right now if you're trying to stay in the APS-C realm, and I will be testing this with this camera, you better believe, as well as with my A6300, 6500. No point in shooting full frame with this, but this lens has gotten stellar reviews, but pretty sure it's like $1,400. So if you're purchasing the 6100, that's not going to be your go-to. In fact, you're probably going to want to get a kit lens like the one you see here, or the longer range kit lens that I have covered in the past. It's really a matter of what you plan on shooting, but I think the 6100, again, is compelling. I mean, when you look at what it delivers, very solid still performance, at least it should be, with the 24 megapixel sensor there, best-in-class autofocus capability, real-time tracking that really no one else can touch in the business. And on top of that, you do now have the flip-around display, so if you're looking to shoot yourself, that sounds wrong, you can, but bear in mind, no in-body stabilization. That's why the common comparison is to the A6400. So I think that it really does check every box that you could have on a budget mirrorless camera. I can't see what it's really missing. And again, I'm going to reiterate, I do not see this in any way, shape, or form to be the successor to the A6000. If anything, point at the A6600. The A6000 was flagship. It wasn't a budget level camera. Just because it was budget friendly, it wasn't aimed as being an entry level. It became that. It stayed a great seller and performer for Sony over all the years because it was affordable. But if you wanted 4K performance, any video performance, I should say, the A6000 was not the camera to choose. This, on the other hand, brings back, in my opinion, the feeling of having the hybrid that can do both, which the A6000 really couldn't. I mean, when 4K wasn't a standard, wasn't available, then yes, the A6000 could do both because its 1080p video was competent. But here, we now have the best of both worlds, minus, as I've said over and over again, a little extra res in the EVF, weather sealing, color profiles, and buffer size. But it still can do everything competently, at least that's the promise on paper. So I'm looking forward to getting it out there, seeing how it performs, and not so much, as I mentioned, necessarily with this, because I don't think that these two really coexist. That lens was really aimed at accommodating the A6600 and bringing a little bit of a focus back to APS-C glass, which Sony has steered away from. But I'll eventually compare this to the 6300, which I think is really the best comparison you can make. They're the most alike, especially in pricing. So while so many people out there are saying, oh, get the 6400, focus on a camera that's of a similar price point, in my opinion, and that's the 6300. Even though I don't think it's in production anymore, it's still certainly available, as is the 6500, but the 6500, that then creates the argument for the 6400. And I'm trying to stay away from that only because I know that a budget camera is about budget. So I'm not going to recommend you buy something that's more expensive unless you have that ability. But there's the first look at the A6100. Again, I think it's compelling for a little under $600 US, and it might be the right camera for a lot of you out there who aren't looking to break the bank, but still want some very solid still and video capability in a light and compact form factor. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them at that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.